Hello, and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. The History with Jackson podcast is presented by Past and Present Media, the home of accessible history. So hi everyone, welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast and part 2 of my interview with Andrew Long. In this second part of the interview, we will be discussing the context of the Cold War period, specifically looking at Cold War Germany, the Berlin Wall, the differences between East and West, and the different contextual backgrounds to the espionage that we have just looked at. This is a fascinating second part of the interview, and I know you guys will enjoy it just as much as you enjoyed the first one. So without further ado, we're going to have our sponsors first and then our episode. Now, I am a massive history nut, hence why I have a podcast, hence why I learned so much about history outside of History of Jackson. And one place that I go to, and I really think you should go to as well, is to one of the sponsors of this show, which is the Past podcast with Veronica Fortune. Now, Past is the podcast about those who would never rule, which I think is an amazing concept, learning about these people who we don't often talk about in history. And if you've ever been curious about why women couldn't inherit the throne of France, or why the 100 Years' War started, then this is the show for you. Veronica covers the almost kings and queens of history and the reasons why they would never rule. And I really think you're going to enjoy the Past podcast, and that's Past, P-A-S-S-E-D. The Past podcast with Veronica Fortune. I really think you're going to enjoy it. Go check it out. Now, here at History of Jackson, I absolutely love finding new places to access historical content. And I know that you need some more historical content to look and read. I also know that some of you are writers, you're looking to start your historical content creator journeys. And for me, one of the best places to start this is thehistorycorner.org or the History Corner blog on Instagram. Now, this is a great hub for creative people to begin their historical content creation journey, and it's a fantastic place for those who are interested in living history or photography to use to begin different methods of collaboration. This is a great place for everyone who's interested in history or involved in history. So that is thehistorycorner.org or the History Corner blog on Instagram. Go check it out. Right, so I want to build some context around the Cold War period and what we're looking at. So Germany is seeming to feature quite heavily within this podcast and within the Cold War espionage kind of spheres. So post-war, Germany and Berlin are split into different zones, and each zone is, as you've touched on earlier, controlled by a different power. How were these zones kind of split, and how much interaction did each nation have with the different zones? Because obviously relationships between the Allies are vastly different post-war as they were pre-war.
I started off, actually, my whole research, if you like, before I even pitched to publishers, was I started to look into the Cold War, and then all roads seemed to lead to Berlin. And this sort of started to make sense, and I started to sort of see patterns forming. So as well as the book for pen and sword on espionage, I also write for a publisher called Hellion, and my mini series that I write for Hellion is all about Cold War Berlin. It's Cold War Berlin, an island city. That's the series name, and I've done 3 in that series so far, and the 4th literally tomorrow will be going off to the editor. So yeah, Berlin, Cold War Berlin, and then how that fits in with Germany is really at the core of my research. And to be honest, Berlin was at the core of the Cold War confrontation. Yes, it happened all around the world in different places, where it became hotter than other places, but yeah, Berlin was key. So as we said, after the Second World War, the Germans surrendered, split into initially 3 zones of occupation: the British, American, and the Soviets. And then as time goes on, the French get let in, and they're given a little slice of the British and a little slice of the American zone to make it up to 4. Those three zones became the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, in 1949, and in 1955 it gained full sovereignty. So the West Germany became a full sovereign nation. The Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, or the Deutsches Demokratische Republik, if you want to hear my bad pronunciation, the DDR, and that happened as a response to the formation of West Germany. That also happened in 1949. Berlin was split in a similar way. So initially 3 sectors, British, American, and the Soviet, and the French were given a chunk of the British sector up in the north of the city to basically bring them to the table. Talk about how relationships break down. Pretty much from the moment of surrender, the relationship between we now divide into 2 camps. We have the Soviets, and then we have the West, and the West is basically British, American, French, subsequently NATO, and they're 2 camps. And they really, as soon as that surrender is signed, those 2 camps start to form, and they get more entrenched over the years. So basically, the Soviets walk out of the 4-power control of Germany in March 1948, something called the Allied Control Council, and they walk out. So basically, you've got these meetings that carried on throughout the whole Cold War, where you had 4 chairs around a table, the French, the Americans, and the British, and the 4th chair was the Soviets, and they never turned up. It was as bleak as that. And then the very same thing happened with Berlin. The Kommandatura, which was the body that was supposed to manage Berlin as a 4-power city, the Soviets walked out in June 1948 and never to turn up again. But the flags were still flown outside, the 4 flags. The Soviet chair was always there, but never taken up. So the relationship started to break down. In terms of how they operated, obviously, the 4-power status of the city still remained. So therefore, a British soldier in uniform had a right to be inside East Berlin. Similarly, a Soviet soldier in uniform had a right to be in West Berlin. And that was the 4-power relationship. And that was carefully maintained throughout the Cold War for lots of reasons, for liaison, the ability to try and keep a communication, and also for espionage as well. Within the zones, so basically the wider DDR and now West Germany, there was this clever arrangement made in 1946 between the British and the Soviets, which gave, on the British side, gave the British the right to send small parties of observers into the Soviet zone, which we know became the DDR, for the purposes of liaison. Now, liaison was never defined, and that suited all parties because it basically allowed the observers to become intelligence collection agents. They were basically allowed by this agreement to travel all around the country. So the observers became part of the British military liaison mission, and that became known as BRIXMIS, BRIXMIS. The Soviets had a reciprocal arrangement. They could travel all around the British zone, and their mission was called SOXMIS. And then in 1947, the Americans and the French had similar arrangements. And these liaison trips, which became known as tours, carried on collecting intelligence. So the shift between liaison, so that's perhaps dealing with displaced people, with returning POWs, with defectors, that sort of liaison between the 2 powers, that carried on, but the shift went to intelligence collection, and that carried all the way through to 1990. So from 1946, where this innovative agreement was set up, it basically governed the intelligence collection within the DDR all the way through to 1990.
And it's fascinating yet again that something is able to kind of continue in that vein, but within a very different guise. Now, how important were these tools then? So we touched upon how they're able to gather intelligence, but how important were they, and how much information were they able to gather from these tools?
Just to answer your last point, it sort of suited both parties to to let this happen, because this whole thing called reciprocity, what we do to you, you will do to us. And basically, it suited the let's say the British to have their people inside East Germany. It suited the Soviets to have their people inside West Germany. They basically did all they could, and it was a very challenging relationship, but basically, ultimately, they wanted it to stay in place. The East Germans hated it with a vengeance, and they did all their best to stop it. But the Soviets would go, because ultimately the Soviets were their masters, and they said, no, it's got to continue. So the intelligence was hugely valuable. It contributed to NATO and British, but NATO's understanding of the Soviet threat. And bear in mind that East Germany was a frontline state, and so was West Germany. That they were basically standing off against each other. All the latest Soviet kit was being sent to the front line, so into the DDR, tanks, anti-aircraft, radar, all the latest military equipment was there, and these TORs, these observers, were able to spot it, photograph it, send it back for analysis. It gave them something called the ground truth. So you may be picking up through HUMINT, you may be picking up through SIGINT that something's happening. But unless you've got boots on the ground, unless you've got somebody there who can drive to a particular place and observe, well, this is either happening or this is not happening, or it's happening very small or it's happening very big, that is hugely valuable intelligence, because the Soviets became very good at disinformation. They're still good. Russians are still good at it now. They would spoof the West that something was happening. They'd play recordings of radio traffic when actually nothing was happening. They'd also deploy divisions, huge numbers of military things in total radio silence. So unless you had boots on the ground who could have a look in a field and say, well, actually, this field is empty, or blimey, this field is packed full of tanks. So they had to, this ground truth was very important. There's another thing called the indicators of hostility. So there was a checklist on a board back at the Military of Defence where, if things were happening, if they started to tick them to go from green to red, it would build up this picture that if you had a board that was all red, you're almost close to World War III. It's that sort of indicator. So these guys on the ground were very, very important for informing the command structure that this is actually happening.
And it's like I've said so many times, because it is such a fascinating topic, that they have these checklists and they're able to do so X, Y, and Z, and things that Russia is doing back in that period in the Cold War, they're still doing today. And it kind of shows that cyclical nature of history yet again. Now, I want to kind of zoom us across to Berlin. And like we just mentioned, Berlin is split up like the rest of Germany. What difficulties come then with splitting up Berlin, splitting up a city that is deep within East Germany?
Well, it was a problem for both sides, really. For the East Germans, it was a major problem, because basically the East German population were voting with their feet. They didn't like what the society that was being built for them in their name, and they were leaving in their droves. And I'm talking about in the hundreds of thousands. It was actually having a dramatic impact on the East German economy and the ability for them to function as a nation, if you like. And they had a name for them. They called them Republik Flüchtlinge, basically people who are fleeing the Republic. And they were leaving, as I said, in their droves. You've got a 1,400-kilometer border between East Germany and West Germany, and that was pretty porous. And so basically people were just nipping across the border, going to a refugee centre and saying, hi, I want to come across, and they were welcomed with open arms. In 1952, the East Germans responded by closing that 1,400-kilometer border, and that became the inner German border. But the problem was, in Berlin, the sector borders, we talked about the 4 sectors, were still open. So you could live in the north of East Germany. You could travel to Berlin, which was in effect their capital city, and then you could stroll literally from one side of the road to the other, and you'd cross into the west. It wasn't as easy as that. You had police basically trying to arrest you and stop you doing it. But if you were clever, you could still make that crossing. So they were losing so many people that they managed to persuade the Soviets, Khrushchev in this case, that they had to close the border inside, and that was the reasoning behind the Berlin Wall. So it was problematic for the East Germans, and they got their way by the building of this monstrous thing called the Berlin Wall that in effect surrounded West Berlin, but it also effectively locked in their population. Then for the West, you had the challenge of how do you keep this island city going? It's 100 or so miles inside East Germany. They'd been allowed 3 air corridors, one from the north, one from the middle, one from the south, several autobahns and railways and waterways as well. And so they were designated routes. You couldn't just this across. You had to follow this particular route, and they were very, very carefully controlled. Then in the city, you had it was obviously the front line. It was right at the epicenter, and they built strong garrisons. So basically, Berlin was, you could say, was indefendable. It was very difficult to handle. But the West, the French, Americans, and British built strong garrisons, and they were very overt in the way they went about their business. They had these lavish parades where they'd drive all these tanks and armored personnel carriers and jeeps and and rows and rows of soldiers through Berlin. And they did them regularly. All of them did it, and that was partly to reassure the West Berliners that they were being protected, but also to show the Soviets, hang on a sec, we are actually a force to be reckoned with. Yes, you would eventually win us over because we are a relatively small force. You could overrun us within perhaps a week, 10 days, but by gum, we're going to give you a fight. And the other way they did it was to have very overt training. So there were these various different bases around West Berlin where they practice firing or throwing hand grenades and tanks driving around. That they weren't able to use heavy artillery training. That all had to be done in West Germany, but they could do pretty much else. And all the time they were doing it, the East Germans were up their towers with their binoculars watching what was going on. So yeah, it was part of this projection of power that went on, and that was how they that they had access, and then within the garrison itself, they projected that power out.
It's great that they're kind of able to have those displays to kind of show, we're not here, like you said, we're not here to mess around. We're here to kind of make sure that these guys are protected and we can hold on to our territory. Now, across this period, and we've touched on it already, talking about the splitting of the powers, the West and Russia become further and further apart. And as you mentioned, with the building of the Berlin Wall, Berlin essentially becomes an island. And that is further shut off as well, with those autobahns and those railways being shut off as well. When does this kind of occur, this shutting off and islandification, for want of a better word, of Berlin occur, and how do the Allies, or what is left of the Allies, work to keep hold of Berlin and keep Berlin going?
Well, it all kicked off in 1948. Stalin decided he'd had enough of these impudent West guys living in Berlin, right in the middle of his sector. So he decided, in a typically blunt way, that he was going to basically shut off the sector. So he closed the roads, he closed the railways, and I mean literally closed. He ripped the rails up, so there was no way a train was going to pass. He blocked off all the canals and so on. The only way that you could get in and out of the city was by air. And as I said, there were these 3 corridors that went across, one from the north, one in the centre, and then one to the south. And basically, there were 2 million people within West Berlin. basically held hostage by this closure, because everything had to be brought into the city. And it was fine when the roads were working. There'd be trucks going up and down. A lot was still carried by water in those days. Again, all that could happen, but then they were closed off. So you had this situation where, crikey, these guys are literally going to starve. The power had been cut off. There was no coal being delivered. It was, a really grim situation, and it's a very brutal macro way of trying to sort of get across your point. The West responded in a extraordinary logistical effort. When in my first book in the series, I sort of look at the airlift as well as the general Cold War context. But the scale of the airlift was unbelievable. Suffice it to say that they managed to feed a city of 2 million people, feed, clothe, heat, and provide a certain level of consumer lifestyle, if you like. So newspapers were continued. They managed to feed that 2 million people for almost a year, supplied entirely by air. And basically these aircraft were landing at the peak of the airlift, sometimes landing every minute in West Berlin. And there were 3 airports. There was Gatow in the British sector, Tegel in the French sector, and Tempelhof in the American sector. And they basically had non-stop flights coming in, delivering, as I said, everything from coal to a light bulb. It was all stops in between. And that carried on for a year. And by the time, so this was in 1948, it started, sort of like 11, 12 months later, they were so efficient in doing that. They could have, in theory, it was hugely costly, but in theory, they could have continued indefinitely. And basically, Stalin realized, he came to a realization that, crikey, the West had responded in a way that I never expected. This could go on forever. I've backed myself into a corner here. The West also came together by forming NATO, that started around the same time. They obviously brought the 3 occupation zones together to form West Germany. All of a sudden, the West were getting their act together, and he was sort of standing out there a bit exposed. So one of the other things, that the West put a reciprocal blockade on East Germany. That's not often talked about. Everyone talks about the other way, but yeah, they put a reciprocal blockade on, and that was beginning to hurt, because basically Stalin relied on information coming from resources being pillaged from East Germany back to the Soviet Union. And when they weren't coming in, because of the blockade, he began to hurt. His people began to hurt. His industry began to grind to a halt. So he had to do this really embarrassing step down. And in effect, the airlift was, he just finished. He lifted the blockade, and that particular chapter was over. The West had decisively won. Stalin had to basically lick his wounds and move on to the next one.
And for a man who didn't like backing down and backing off, that must have been an incredibly difficult thing for Stalin.
Yeah. But then, things then happened. Stalin detonated his atomic bomb in August 1949. The powers, the tectonic plates, if you like, sort of the Cold War then shifted again, and you had in sort of West Germany, you had this economic miracle that was going on. The Marshall Plan was basically kick-starting the economy there, and it was thriving. West Germany in the 50s and 60s was a really happening place. There was a lot going on. The standard of living was huge. In the East, it was stagnating. It was grim. The people were firstly voting with their feet. They were trying to escape, trying to get across to the West, but also they really weren't very happy. And there was stagnation. There was civil unrest. There were riots in Berlin, all over Germany, actually, all over Eastern Germany in 1953, that was basically put down by Soviet tanks. Lots of people were killed. But you could see that again the fault lines have shifted, and you've got a miracle going on, economic miracle going on in the West, and in the East, it really wasn't working, and they had to make great efforts to try and win the people over, and it was really touch and go for the East German government for a few years until they were able to try and placate the masses, if you like. So yeah, the fault lines were definitely the battle lines were being drawn, and that gave us the Cold War.
And it's intriguing to see those differences between East and West, and to see how these splits and so on were enforced. Now, I have a final fun question for you, Andrew, and it's been great to speak to you today. You in your books, and when everyone gets a copy of this, they're going to look at the beginning, and they're going to see your glossary of abbreviations, and it is quite frankly immense and really quite impressive. What is your favorite acronym that you have used, and why?
I mean, when you're dealing with the military, and particularly with the espionage, you can't get away from these acronyms. They're everywhere, and they use it partly to, I think, keep people confused because it suits them. My favourite one is Maud, MAUD. Now, it's not actually an acronym. It was the code name for the British atomic bomb project, and that's before it became tube alloys, which is equally obscure. But what I like about it is Maud. People tried to understand what Maud was, and all these theories get military application of uranium detonation or something like that. They tried to sort of understand it. Actually, the truth is much more simple. It was a random word chosen from a telegram that was sent by one of the physicists. Maud Ray, to give the lady her full name, was one of his children's governesses, tutors, sort of thing. And so he just took the word Maud and decided, oh, well, let's call the committee Maud. But for years, I had people guessing as to what it actually stood for, when actually all it was a lady's name plucked randomly from a telegram. So that's how sometimes these myths are made.
And it's brilliant to see the way that life can just kind of join in with these, incredibly dangerous and secretive parts of
Truth,
life.
the
Yeah.
truth is stranger than fiction, they often say. Yeah.
Now, obviously, people are going to want to get a copy of your books. So we have Secrets of the Cold War, and we have, very grateful to Helion as well for sending me the two copies, if I don't bash my mic, the first two volumes of your mini series. So where can people grab a copy of your books?
Yeah, so the best way of getting hold of the book is to go to Pen and Sword's website, and that's pen-and-sword.co.uk, penandsword.co.uk. And those lovely people are giving a 30% discount during the month of May this year, 2023. So for the rest of the month, yeah, 30% off RRP is a cracking deal. If, however, you don't get moving quick enough and you miss that great offer, then if you put the code podcast20 in, you'll get 20% off, which is, again, very nice of them to do that for us. But yeah, it'd be great for you guys to pick up a copy. And also, if you have a look at helion.co.uk, HELION, then you can search for Andrew Long, and you'll see my 3 volumes in the mini series, and hopefully by the summer there'll be a 4th.
And these are really great books, and we've touched on a tiny portion of some of the amazing stories within these books. So I do really recommend that you guys go away and try and get a copy. And, secondly, Andrew, people are going to want to get in touch with you and learn more directly from you. Where can they find you?
Well, obviously, you can get hold of me via the publishers we've just mentioned. I've got a website, which is andrewlong.info, and I try and keep that up to date with information about the books, the latest publications, and there's a sort of mailing list you can subscribe to. And then if you look on Facebook's under Andrew Long Books, you'll find me there, and I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm on Twitter and Instagram, but I never actually find the time to do anything there. But yeah, you sort of search around and you'll find some stuff.
Awesome. And have you got any, you just mentioned the third and fourth books within your miniseries. Have you got any more works that are coming out, and if they're about to come out, how can people get hold of them?
Well, so volume 4 in the Berlin series with Hellion, as I said, literally tomorrow I'll be sending that off to my editor. I spent the last few days in a world of editing hell, but I've got through it. I've survived the experience. Anyway, so that should hopefully be out in the summer. And as I think I mentioned earlier, I'm currently working on a history of bricksmiths, which is a great project. I mean, I'm absolutely loving every minute of it because it's such a fascinating story, and I'm working with the Bricksmiths Association to tell the story because the guys are getting older. There are less of them every year because this operation obviously ran from 1946 through to 1990. So time carries on, but there's some amazing stories of oh crikey, adventure, daring do, danger, violence, intrigue. I mean, it's all there. So I'm loving that. So that should hopefully be out with Pen and Sword next year.
Oh, fantastic. I'm really looking forward to that one. Hopefully we can have a conversation about that one close to the time when it comes out.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the pod, Andrew, and it's been a pleasure to learn from you.
Thank you for having me. I very much enjoyed it.